Sheffield, an industrial city in the north of England, is known for its industrial past and quiet, hardworking neighborhoods where generations of working families live. In the green surroundings of this city, against the backdrop of the majestic hills of the Peak District, was the home of Sarah Barrass and her 6 children. At first glance, it was an ordinary 2-story house, which did not stand out from the others. However, locals noted that the Barrass house always seemed a little isolated, as if its walls hid a secret that only its inhabitants knew about. Sarah Barrass was a woman who rarely attracted attention. At the age of 34, she was already raising 6 children, and, according to her, all her attention was focused solely on their well-being. Her life seemed to be closed, completely subordinated to a strict schedule and filled with caring for children. Outwardly, Sarah seemed to be a conscientious mother, although her communication with neighbors and people around her was very limited. She tried to stay away, rarely left the house, and only occasionally could she be seen in the store or near the school where her children went. Her children, Tristan, Blake, and 4 other younger ones, were always by her side, as if connected by an invisible thread that did not allow her to move far from her family. The eldest, Tristan and Blake, who were 13 and 14 years old, attended a local school and rarely started conversations with other children. Their classmates noticed that they were almost always quiet and seemed to be immersed in themselves, as if they were afraid to say something superfluous or even just speak out. They stuck together, and no one had ever seen any of them make friends with any of their peers. Their teachers recalled that the Barras children seemed kind and obedient, but withdrawn and anxious. The atmosphere in the family was so closed that many neighbors did not even know that the father of all the children was Brandon Machine, a man who rarely appeared in public and maintained a very peculiar relationship with Sarah Barrass. Brandon was several years older than Sarah and always gave the impression of a man who was used to dominating and controlling the situation. Their relationship was not advertised, but those who knew this family better had vague suspicions about the difficult dynamics of their ties. Outwardly, it seemed that Sarah was raising the children alone, but Brandon was present in their lives, influencing the children and Sarah herself. It was difficult to notice the oddities in the behavior of the Barrass family, as they skillfully hid their internal structure. But those few who did notice the disturbing details still had the feeling that something dark and deeply hidden was going on in the house. Some neighbors noticed that children practically do not leave the house and rarely play outside. Sometimes muffled voices were heard, and once a neighbor confessed that once she thought she heard strange sounds resembling muffled screams. But she explained all this to herself with childish pranks, not daring to attach importance to her observations. Despite this, the Barrass house was a surprisingly quiet place, as if the very atmosphere there was saturated with tension and depression. Some parents of children who studied with Tristan and Blake noted that the boys had a wary look, and sometimes a distant one. One of the teachers, who wished to remain anonymous, recalled that the children often looked worried, as if they were burdened by something. But they answered all the teacher's questions with restraint and avoided topics related to the family. The isolation of Sarah Barrass and her children has become increasingly apparent in recent years. Social services were virtually unaware of this family, as Sarah rarely sought help or support. This further strengthened the atmosphere of secrecy and mystery. Her environment in Sheffield saw that she almost completely refused to communicate with the outside world, and her children also did not have the usual social connections. Parents of children from school said that the boys came and went together, never stayed for extracurricular activities, and avoided communicating with classmates. Some neighbors, seeing this isolation, began to notice that the Barrass children hardly spend time outside, even in the warmer months. These circumstances formed a disturbing picture. Sarah and Brandon seemed to be obsessed with the idea of isolation and control over children. No one knew what was hiding behind their closed doors, or what was going on in the house when no one was around. Sarah Barrass's house, located on a quiet street in Sheffield, seemed like many others, small with 2 floors, a well-maintained facade, and windows from which you could see children playing outside. Even the rare visits of local residents to Sarah ended with a feeling of awkwardness, as if the atmosphere of the house absorbed the guests, leaving them with an uneasy feeling that something was wrong here. Tristan and Blake, Sarah's 2 eldest sons, often looked out the window, discreetly watching the street, as if they were outsiders, not residents of the area. Neighbors have repeatedly seen the boys just standing at the window, as if waiting for something or someone. They hardly played outside, unlike other children, which made the locals uneasy. No one knew exactly what the Barras children were doing during the day, as Sarah rarely allowed them to leave the house, let alone have friends. The house became their little universe, which they practically never left. In May 2019, when police officers arrived at the house, they were greeted by a truly eerie sight. There was an ominous silence in the room, almost tangible, and the situation itself seemed to freeze, reflecting the terrible picture that had unfolded in recent hours. It seemed that the house, which once served as a shelter for children, had become a place of unprecedented horror. The police, who expected to see a typical family setting, were amazed that they were confronted with a scene filled with tragedy and shock. Every detail inside seemed to convey a sense of continuous tension, which, as they later noticed, had accumulated over many years. In one of the rooms, the police found the bodies of 2 older children, 14-year-old Blake and 13-year-old Tristan, who were brutally murdered. Sarah Barrass, as it turned out later, took their lives herself. The boys were lying on their beds, and according to investigators, their expressions were calm, as if they did not suspect anything and did not have time to understand what was happening in the last moments. The walls around were sterile, almost empty, and there were no toys or decorations typical of children's rooms in the room. All the furniture in the house was created more for functionality than for comfort. There were no photos, drawings, or other signs of family warmth. But, as investigators later established, Sarah Barrass did not stop there. Her plans were to get rid of all 6 children, and it was only thanks to the intervention of the police and an unfortunate combination of circumstances that the rest of the children survived. The police who conducted the search found 4 younger children in a state of deep shock, hiding in different parts of the house. The older children were dead, and the remaining siblings were under the strongest influence of the tragedy that had literally become before their eyes. Some of the younger children tried to hide and could not explain what was happening, while others were so depressed that they did not respond to police questions. The officers themselves, who later testified at the trial, said that the atmosphere in the house was so suffocating that they had the impression that this place kept the shadow of the horror that had happened here. Each room seemed to tell about the years of isolation and psychological pressure that the children were going through. The police found that the children's rooms were minimally furnished, without toys, bright colors, or signs of childish joy. The houses where children live are usually filled with laughter, joy, and disorder, but here it was strikingly empty and quiet. It seemed that no one was allowed to show emotion or have fun in this house. In one of the rooms, among Sarah's personal belongings, investigators found her diaries and notes that her mother had left. These diaries turned out to be an important find, as they contained her thoughts and statements that could possibly shed light on her psychological state. Some of the recordings contained dark and disturbing thoughts, such as, "I don't see a way out anymore," and "they shouldn't suffer." These words made it clear to the investigators that Sarah felt trapped, and that perhaps she considered her actions an act of ridding the children of those difficulties that she herself could no longer withstand. Being in a state of deep psychological pressure, she planned to deal with all her children. During a further search, police found evidence that Sarah and Brandon Machine, the children's father, had prepared a number of drugs and other means that could have been used to kill them. Among the finds were pills and other drugs that, in high doses, could be fatal. The police concluded that the couple had tried to use medical means to carry out their plans. Several older children complained of feeling unwell and, as it turned out, Sarah could have mixed drugs into their food to create the appearance of natural deterioration. Later, the examination confirmed that some drugs had been administered to children before the incident. This deviation from normal care was further evidence that Sarah and Brandon's actions were deliberate and carefully planned. According to investigators, when the use of drugs did not give the desired results, Sarah and Brandon resorted to physical violence. This led to tragic consequences for the two eldest sons, whose lives were cut short in this house. When the neighbors found out about the incident, they were shocked. For many of them, Sarah and her children remained a mystery, a family that did not have close ties with others. But few people could have imagined that something so terrible was happening behind the closed doors of the Barras house. One of the neighbors later recalled that he had heard screams from the house a couple of times, but then did not attach any importance to this, blaming it on ordinary family conflicts. However, knowing about the tragedy now, he wondered if he could have prevented what happened if he had paid more attention to the unusual behavior of the children and their mother back then. The police documented every find in detail, from medical supplies to Sarah's personal records. All this became part of a large-scale investigation, which showed that at the heart of these terrible events was a deep psychological disorder and tension that had been accumulating within this family for years. The children themselves, as it turned out later, did not understand exactly what was happening, but a feeling of fear and depression was written on their faces at the time of the police's arrival, as if they were prepared for the worst. Investigators continued to explore the house in search of additional evidence and analyzed every detail to understand how such a tragedy could have become possible. The surrounding people who lived nearby could not imagine that all this was happening in their own neighborhood. When the police collected all the evidence found in Sarah Barrass's house, the officers realized that what had happened was not an accident, but a brutally planned crime. Medical reports, correspondence between Sarah and Brandon, strange diary entries. All this clearly indicated that they deliberately went to the death of children. Every piece of evidence added up to the big picture, and for the investigators there was no doubt. The murders were carefully thought out and executed with cold calculation. The investigators understood that there could be only one motive for this tragedy. Sarah and Brandon, feeling tension, fear of the future, and feeling at a dead end, saw the murder of children as a kind of way of liberation. From the correspondence that the police found on the suspects' phones, it followed that they discussed the only way out, salvation, and freedom, which clearly indicated their perverted idea of solving the problem. Apparently, Sarah and Brandon came to the conclusion that they would not be able to give their children the future they considered acceptable, and chose to take their lives rather than give them a chance to live outside their control. Experts involved in the investigation suggested that Sarah and Brandon may have suffered from severe psychological disorders that led to a distorted perception of reality and desperate decisions. When all the evidence was examined and brought into a single picture, investigators decided to arrest Sarah Barrass and Brandon Machine. The officers understood that the detention should be carried out as carefully as possible and without provocation, since the behavior of the accused was unpredictable. They expected either a sharp reaction or an attempt at denial. However, the arrest was surprisingly quiet. Both suspects seemed resigned to their situation even before they were handcuffed. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table when the police entered the house. Her face remained impassive, and her gaze was fixed on one point, as if she was lost in her own thoughts and expected to be taken away. Brandon, on the contrary, was at the window and, hearing the footsteps of the officers, barely flinched, but did not resist. Investigators immediately noted the strange calmness of the suspects. This was not the behavior of people overcome by shock or fear of arrest. On the contrary, they seemed to accept their arrest as something natural and inevitable. As Sarah was being led out of the house, she stared for a moment at her younger children who had been left with neighbors, and her face distorted with a strange mixture of emotions, which one of the officers later described as a feeling of devastation. Immediately after the arrest, Sarah Barrass and Brandon Machine were taken to the police station for questioning. The investigators understood that they were facing a difficult case. Both suspects seemed internally prepared for interrogations, and it was obvious that they were not going to confess right away. During the first interrogations, Sarah was very calm. She spoke evenly and with restraint, showing no visible signs of agitation. She answered questions about the children's deaths, briefly and with obvious coldness, assuring that everything that happened was a terrible accident. She insisted that the children died due to a tragic combination of circumstances and claimed that she was still in a state of shock. Investigators described her responses as devoid of emotion, which immediately aroused police suspicions. The mother, who lost her two eldest sons, showed neither grief nor despair. Sarah seemed to be trying to keep the situation under control, making sure that her every word sounded restrained and neutral. She avoided details and often spoke in general phrases, as if she wanted to distance herself as much as possible from what had happened. Her behavior made the investigators wary. The lack of emotional reactions indicated her complete indifference to what had happened, or even an inner awareness of guilt, which she was not going to admit. Brandon Machine also behaved with extreme caution and detachment. During the first interrogations, he insisted that he knew nothing about the tragedy and could not even imagine that Sarah was capable of such a thing. He claimed that he was outside the house at the time of the children's deaths and that his shock from the incident was as great as everyone else's. Brandon tried to appear like a depressed and grieving father, but his testimony sounded insincere and aroused strong distrust among investigators. When asked about his correspondence with Sarah, where they discussed the liberation of children, he answered vaguely, claiming that these were simple conversations that had no real meaning. But the investigators did not believe his words. The tone and content of these messages clearly indicated that the couple had a planned conspiracy. Realizing that they were facing two people who had prepared for the interrogations, the investigators decided to use the accumulated evidence to gradually destroy their lines of defense. They knew that the abrupt presentation of all the evidence could cause Sarah and Brandon to abruptly refuse and close up. So the police began with milder pressure to bring the accused to the moment of confession. The investigators were the first to present medical reports that clearly indicated the presence of drugs in the bodies of the dead children that had not been prescribed to them for medical reasons. The examination showed that these substances could weaken the health of children and lead to their death. The evidence was incontrovertible, and investigators said that these drugs could not have entered the body by accident. They expected Sarah to start getting confused in her testimony, but she just froze for a moment and then said with restraint that she has no idea how this could happen. Her attempt to ignore the fact of using drugs looked artificial and further alerted investigators. The police then produced recordings of correspondence between Sarah and Brandon found on their phones. In these messages, they discussed the only way out, salvation, and liberation. These words were alarming and showed that the couple saw the murder of children as a kind of way out of the situation. At first, Sarah tried to deny the meaning of these messages, claiming that her words were misunderstood. She claimed that she had discussed the general difficulties of parenting, but the investigators understood that there was something more behind these words. When the correspondence was presented to Brandon, he tried to justify himself by saying that the discussions with Sarah were the result of stress and that he did not mean anything serious. His explanations became more and more vague, and the answers began to seem artificial and thought out in advance. Investigators noticed that Brandon avoided direct answers and tried to change the subject, as if hoping that the evidence against them could still be explained. Over time, Brandon became confused in his testimony. Initially, he claimed that he did not know about Sarah's intentions, but later, under pressure from questions, he admitted that he was aware of her problems and thoughts, but did not believe that she was really capable of this. This phrase became an important clue for the investigators. They now realized that Brandon may have been not just a passive observer, but supported Sarah in her distorted ideas about saving children. As the interrogations progressed, Brandon began to realize that his version was collapsing and tried to distance himself from his original words, but this only strengthened the investigators in their suspicions. All this led to the moment when it became obvious that their line of defense was crumbling. The evidence against them was too strong, and no matter how hard Sarah and Brandon tried to resist, they couldn't deny the facts. In desperation, Sarah became more and more silent, becoming detached, as if preparing for the inevitable. Her behavior changed dramatically when investigators brought a psychologist to her to discuss her internal state. In this environment, realizing that the pressure was becoming overwhelming, Sarah finally gave up. When the investigators summed up all the evidence, it became clear to Sarah and Brandon that they would not be able to escape responsibility. Sarah was sitting across from the investigator. An inner struggle was visible on her face. She was silent for a long time, as if gathering her thoughts, before finally saying softly, "Yes, I did it." Her words sounded like a thud, and there was silence in the room. Sarah admitted that she felt life was becoming unbearable, that she saw no way out, and believed that children should not suffer. Sarah's confession was short and devoid of special emotions. It seemed that she had thought out this confession in advance and was just waiting for the moment when she would have to say it. Brandon, hearing her words, couldn't hide his shock. He looked at her with surprise and fear, as if realizing that everything they were heading for had collapsed. Sarah's words, her unexpected and direct confession, became a turning point in the course of the investigation and led to the fact that the case against her and Brandon Machan began to develop with incredible speed. The investigators understood that the confession, made without hesitation and excuses, almost devoid of emotion, could be used as the main evidence in court. Now it did not take a long time to collect additional evidence to prove the intent of her actions. Sarah made it clear that she committed this crime deliberately, believing that in this way she would free the children from suffering. This line of defense pointed to a deeply distorted perception of reality, but at the same time to her inner confidence that she had not just taken the children's lives, but had saved them. Sarah Barrass's confession allowed prosecutors to draw up a clear and convincing indictment. Lawyers understood that Sarah's words could be used in court as a key argument, proving the premeditation of the murders and her full awareness of her actions. It also simplified the process of gathering evidence against Brandon Machan, whose position began to crumble after Sarah's confession. The confirmation of her guilt became the basis for speeding up the case, and the trial began much earlier than expected. Now that the key figure Sarah had already pleaded guilty, the court had to decide on the extent of Brandon's guilt and his role in this tragedy. Sarah Barrass's words put a lot of pressure on Brandon, putting him at an extreme disadvantage. Sarah's confession had effectively deprived him of the opportunity to build a defense based on a denial of guilt, and now he had to either accept the accusations or try to shift all the blame onto Sarah. But correspondence, medical reports, and records of the investigation indicated his awareness and moral assistance in the preparation of the crime. No longer remaining in the shadows, he found himself at the forefront of the case. At trial, prosecutors proved that Brandon was aware of Sarah's psychological state and her decision to commit a crime, which made him indirectly, but still a participant in the tragedy. Under the pressure of evidence, Brandon, realizing the inevitability of a guilty verdict, eventually admitted that he knew about Sarah's plans, but claimed that he considered her incapable of such cruel actions. The trial of Sarah Barrass and Brandon Machan began with huge attention from the public. The story of how parents became responsible for the death of their own children shocked not only the residents of Sheffield, but also the whole of Great Britain. The courtroom was attended by media representatives, lawyers, prosecutors, as well as relatives and friends of the dead children, who came to hear what punishment those who destroyed their lives would suffer. Sarah Barrass was as restrained in court as she was during the interrogations. She continued to show detachment and showed little emotion. Brandon Machine, on the other hand, looked more anxious. His gaze constantly darted, and he seemed to not know how to react to everyone's attention. Prosecutors immediately presented key evidence, including Sarah's confession, medical reports, and correspondence between the defendants. The trial was fast and extremely strict. The judge, speaking after the announcement of the evidence, noted, "This case is one of the scariest I've ever had to deal with. These children did not know what a normal childhood life was. They were isolated, out of touch with the world, and, worst of all, trusted those who were supposed to protect them." He stressed that the actions of Sarah Barrass and Brandon Machine were not just a crime, but also a betrayal towards those who needed protection and love. The judge recalled that Sarah and Brandon not only took the lives of their 2 children, but also put the lives of the others at risk. Their actions showed how deeply they were mired in their own problems, and how a distorted perception of reality became an excuse for them. The judge stated, "Your actions cannot be justified by any theory. You abused the trust that the children had in you, and you did it in the most terrible way." The jury, after listening to the evidence and testimony presented, were in shock and could barely contain their emotions. In their reviews after the completion of the case, many of them admitted that the decision was extremely difficult. "It was one of the most emotionally difficult trials we had to go through," one of the jurors later admitted. Another juror added, "What we heard in court left no doubt about their guilt, but even when the truth became clear, it was impossible to believe it to the end." The verdict was unanimous. The jury concluded that Sarah Barrass and Brandon Machine were guilty of premeditated and brutal murder, as well as conspiracy to murder the other children. There was no doubt for the jury. This crime could not have been the result of a short-term mental disorder or an impulsive decision. It was planned, and the defendants were aware of the consequences of their actions. After the unanimous verdict of the jury, the judge made the final decision. Sarah Barrass was sentenced to life in prison without the right to parole. In his final appeal to her, the judge noted, "Your actions have destroyed the lives of your children, destroyed families, and caused untold pain and grief. You will have to spend the rest of your life realizing that you have deprived your children of a future." Sarah Barrass accepted the verdict silently, with only a slight nod, as if she fully agreed with the decision. Brandon Machine, despite attempts to shift responsibility to Sarah, was also found guilty of complicity in murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The judge stressed, "Your tacit consent and support were tantamount to complicity. You did not stop her, and by your inaction, you became part of this crime." Kagtripam